Hi everyone, my name's Hannah. I'm the co-founder of Shado, and I'm really excited to be hosting this event tonight with an absolutely brilliant panel of speakers. And so I will just kick off straight away. I will let everyone introduce themselves because I'm sure they'll do it a bit better than I will. And so I'll just start with Ben, who is on my left on my screen.
Oh shit. Okay, hi, I'm Ben. My name's Ben Smoke. I'm the political editor at Hark Magazine, where I cover lots of like the protest stuff and activism in the movement. I also was one of the Stansted 15, who were a group of 15 people who gained access to a remote part of Stansted Airport in March 2017 and tied ourselves around a charter flight that was due to deport around 60 people to Nigeria and Ghana, including people that we knew to be vulnerable and at risk of violence and torture and trafficking, were they to be deported. We were then charged with terror offences, convicted, and then in January this year, those convictions were overturned. So, and now I'm a free man.
Yes. Are we just gonna like pass it around to each other?
Yeah, go for it.
All right, fine. I'm Aviah. I, in my day job, am a criminology lecturer at Birkbeck, and all the rest of the time that God gives me, I'm organising in Sisters Uncut, which is a direct action group fighting cuts to domestic violence services and state violence. And also more recently, you're going to find me as part of the Kill the Bill coalition. Broad-based movement trying to fight the proposed police and crime and sentencing bill. Very authoritarian, very evil, but massive solidarity movement that's gonna kill it in its tracks. Yeah, that's it.
I'll go next. Hi, I'm Nim. I am an activist and educator, so I work with lots of different grassroots groups and campaign orgs around campaign strategy, and particularly in relation to like anti-oppression and bringing in like the values of our politics into the way that we do the work, including abolition. But I'm also an activist and organizer, and have done a lot of community organising, particularly with queer and trans people of colour in London and across the UK and Europe. But for the last few years, predominantly focusing on trans rights as a trans person in the UK in the current transphobic shit show that is the UK right now. And I think most significant to this part of one of the projects that I work on is Trans Abolitionist Futures, working with trans people across the UK, kind of like solidarity learning around abolition, and then trying to use that as a way to then inform and pivot people into action and organising on the ground where they are in the UK. So that's me. I'll hand over to you, Simone.
Thanks, Nim. Hi, everyone. I'm Simone, pronoun she, her. In my day job, I work at NUS on the Decolonise Education campaign. And then outside of work, I do some climate organising. I used to do climate organising in Bristol, but now I'm in London. It's in London. And outside of that as well, I also run workshops around climate justice and climate racism, especially exploring like social and environmental movements in the 20th and 21st century.
Great, thank you all so much. I did miss out my important housekeeping note for our audience, which is please feel free to kind of comment on the comment section because we're live on Facebook at the moment. And if you've got any questions that you want to ask the panel, if you just write them in there, and we'll try and get to them at the end, last 15 minutes or so. But yeah, thank you all for coming, and yeah, to my panel, it's really, really great to finally meet all of you. And I would like to kick off with a very broad question, which is how would you define the abolition movement, and can we talk a bit about its roots? And I don't mind who starts.
I can go. Just to break the ice. So yeah, the way I like to think about the origins of the sort of current iteration of the abolitionist movement as we kind of like know it and experience it, I guess like I position it as coming out of some of the conditions that were happening in the sort of 60s and 70s. So the sort of parent movement to our movement were some of the social movements that were happening in the 60s and 70s, revolutionary movements, like Black Panthers, all the anti-racist and anti-colonial movements that are happening all over the globe that very nearly took down capitalism at one point. And as a response to that, capital really shifted up its game. And that's when we started to see in sort of 80s and 90s, a big shift of capital outside of the global north to the global south, but also huge populations of working class, mostly disproportionately Black and brown working class people who are just surplus to requirements. And that's when you see prisons kind of go in turbocharge. I see it as a kind of almost a revenge of capital against working class radical movements. And that, for me, kind of like positions like went to kind of understanding that when prisons became the prison industrial complex that we understand it today, and when policing and prisons and surveillance and deportation and immigration enforcement really went turbocharge. And that's when our movements kind of had to respond with a specific abolitionist framing and understanding where that came from and why that happened. But at the same time, we kind of like take a lot of inspiration from previous abolitionist movements. So like the abolitionist movement to end slavery is an important kind of also way of thinking about roots that goes even further back, right? So yeah, one person that kind of springs to mind in particular when it comes to like inspiration is W.E.B. Du Bois, who did a lot of work on reconstruction after slavery. And that it shouldn't just be about like we end slavery and that's it, and that's done, that's the movement. And similarly, the project that we've got now, it's not just about, okay, we close down the prisons and that's all we need to do. We need to like actually rebuild our society. Like it's actually a revolutionary movement. We can't take down the prisons and not have a revolution. So like, and W.E.B. Du Bois is like kind of writing, I think can take a lot of inspiration from the roots going way back to that movement.
Thank you so much. I think that's the perfect introduction. And I just wanted to pick up on your kind of point that it's not just like defunding the police, abolishing like prisons. It like abolitionist thinking goes further than that. And so I wondered if anyone kind of wanted to jump in there in terms of like applying an abolitionist mindset to kind of other systems of oppression.
I can take it if no one else wants to. I think I would agree with like everything that was said then, and I think you're right. It has to go much further. This can't be a successful project without spreading it out. If you want to look at specific things like social work, things like psychiatry, things like the law as an entity, as it stands, the entire criminal justice system. These things, maybe not abolishing social work, but completely and utterly reframing what it is, who does it, what purpose it serves, who the arbitrators of these kind of services to society and what ends are they serving. So when we talk about abolition, we do need to talk about it as a much, much bigger project. And I think we need to see it as something that it's a generations long project and has been for hundreds, centuries. I think I was like looking like a quick cursory Google earlier, and there was like a presidential candidate in the US in 1844 who had abolition like as one of his campaign promises. And so this isn't something that's new. It's not sort of like sprung up. We're building on decades and centuries of thinking, but we also need to recognize that this isn't going to happen tomorrow. And the reality is that the only way to make this a successful project is to kind of reframe our thinking about the entirety of society. It is a revolutionary project, and it's one that is exciting, and it should be, it's like fertile ground for imagination of like what a world could look like. And that for me is what abolition is, and why it's so integral to like us as people that want to see justice and people that want to see a society where everybody is happy and free.
I could add something to that, which is that I think as well that often people's orientation or learning and understanding of abolition is that they are doing things, or they are politically aware about things in their lives, or that they're organizing around, and then discover abolition as a framework, which kind of starts in the common mind around prisons, and then think about how do I apply that to other systems. But I would actually say, I mean, I'm not a historian, so just to be clear, I'm not claiming to be, but I would actually say that to understand really how systems are connected, we have to go back to the beginning. And so as Aviah said, like my knowledge and learning about abolition is almost exclusively based in North America and Europe. And so just to name that as well as a kind of bias to my understanding, but that if we understand the building and growth of abolitionary movements through slavery, and the construction of industrial capitalism and colonization by Northern Europe, we can actually see the ways that a lot of the systems that we talk about in abolition are connected, not just in impact, but in their very creation. So from borders and the literal enforcement of borders, to domestic and gender-based violence, to racism and the construction of racism and application of that, to the kind of political expansion of the philosophy of eugenics that applied to racialized people, but also disabled people, queer people, women, etc., which then links us into psychiatry, has been brought up, to housing and land, and who owns the land and how that affects our housing rights, as well as then policing and prisons. So like the Met Police the police force that was created pre what became established as the Met Police were established to stop working class people in London robbing goods from the ships that were coming in from slave plantations in the Caribbean of the goods that were coming in. And so when you start to actually look back through the history of abolition, it's not just that we're applying a kind of like nice framework to other areas, it's that all of this is connected. And so like once slavery officially was becoming abolished in the US, we then see, as Aviah pointed to, the kind of prison industrial complex set up in the 13th Amendment, which was basically an amendment of the US Constitution that says, in essence, slavery is still legal as long as people are incarcerated. And so that's why we start to see this industrialization of the prison kind of complex as a way to not lose slave labor, but to relocate the moral justification for slave labor. And creating prisons as a place to, in the best sense, hide problems instead of dealing with them, but actually, in the worst sense, consciously and intentionally create a space where slave labor could be continued. And so I think when you go back through that into the kind of like, where does, like those two questions I think are linked is what I'm trying to say, of like, what are the systems?
Thank you so much. And kind of continuing on from that, Simone, I wanted to kind of turn to you for, you recently wrote a piece for Shado about kind of how abolition and climate justice are intrinsically linked because they're both, centered in community care and building back differently. And so I wondered if you'd be like, you'd want to explain a bit more about this link.
Yeah, definitely. So like there's such a massive link between like climate justice and abolition because they're both sort of imaginative projects rooted in like community action and justice, and like both require like an abolishing of systems that seek to like extract and exploit and dominate people and the planet, such as colonization or like capitalism. And like both require us to kind of treasure and acknowledge the interconnectedness of our relationships to people and the planet, and that also transcends borders. And like it's important to sort of understand how like the fight for climate justice, it's important to recognize how climate activists and defenders are often imprisoned or killed over defending their land, resources, and communities against like private companies and governments and owners. And like the fact that the police, the prison and legal system is on the side of like protecting this property and profit over the resources and people in extraction, that it sort of tells you that what side the legal system and the police are on. And like it lets you know that they're on the side of like both social and environmental injustice. And like they do purposely quell movements and displace people in order to continue this profit and continue this extraction. And like such examples include like, for example, the Black Lives Matter UK 2016 air pollution action. And that was where they blocked City Airport, and like they were nearly charged with like terrorism charges simply for, you know, making a statement about how air quality disproportionately affects people of color, particularly Black people in the area. And then we go forward to the FRAC 34 and even, you know, the Stansted 15, who were nearly charged with terrorism charges. And we then again relate that globally to how like in South America in 2018, they had the highest number of climate defenders killed at the time. So like we can see that like in the context of climate justice and abolition, it's a deeply connected and global struggle for justice. And like sort of when speaking about like community and care and like climate justice and abolition, it's about trying to create a world that is loving and safe and healthy and green and accessible. And it forces us to think about how we create that sort of locally and globally. Like how are we creating self-sustainable structures and futures that amongst each other? Like how do we kind of share our homes? How do we share food and space and resources and education and like create the community that we want to see? And like it's important to kind of note that like the seeds planted today don't manifest as the food tomorrow. And I guess that's a way to kind of see abolition and climate justice, is like it's an ongoing project that shapes and shifts to the communities that community needs. And like it requires building this trust and relationship between one another. And like to kind of end on it as well, it's like important to note that sort of the highest levels of like public safety or like ecological justice are happening in areas that are the most resourced. So it's not necessarily around like whether there's increased police or increased like crackdown on crime in quotation marks. We see like the most thriving neighborhoods, both socially, ecologically, economically, politically, are the ones that have like secure employment, decent healthcare, mental health provisions, like youth service provisions for drug users, support for survivors of domestic abuse, and like loads more community infrastructure. So that's where we can be working, and those are the tangible ways that we can build the world that we want to see.
I was gonna, is it right to come in on that? Or like after that? Yeah, I was gonna say like around this stuff, like I think it's very important to like ground our analysis in a material understanding of why policing in prisons exist in the first place, like which, you know, everyone's already kind of touched on. But connected with that, I do think, you know, the North American kind of analysis around abolition has been crucially important. One of the things that's quite difficult about that is that, you know, as Nim kind of like touched on, is that actually those systems of policing and prisons actually started with the British Empire. They started with British imperialism, and America is an example of that. It's a settler colonial, and it's like, you know, turbocharging the way it like operates. But it fundamentally, this country, people in this country, capitalists in this country, took systems of policing and prisons to that settler colony and settler colonies all over the world, right? And like right-wing historians still like to boast that Britain colonized a quarter of the globe's surface, and it took these systems of policing and prison, which did not exist in these places before, there in order to like manage populations, in order to protect their wealth, in order to be able to extract resources, in order to divide and rule like workers and colonize people. This is why they brought it in, and this is how it still operates now, you know. And I think it's important to kind of ground our analysis and understand our analysis, is that fundamentally this is about capitalism and it's about imperialism. And that means that we need to be hella internationalist, like so internationalist. And one of the things I think is quite frustrating sometimes is that like we all let like those histories of colonialism off the hook so often in our analysis. Yeah. So like, what is the connection between our movements for abolition in Britain and the movement End SARS in Nigeria, or the policing in Palestine, you know, and the policing systems in Palestine? You know, there's so many campaigns that are going on right now against policing, against prisons, against surveillance all over the world that actually are rooted in our systems that started here in Britain. And we tend not to really have a very internationalist analysis of that. And we tend not to link those struggles. And like fundamentally, like, I think if we're going to be able to, you know, Simone was talking just now so eloquently about like climate justice. And if we're going to be able to achieve that, we're going to have to actually understand what is it that connects all of these systems of oppression, all of these systems of policing and prisons, all of these systems of capital. Like what is it that connects us? You know what I mean? So like, yeah, fundamentally like that, it is important to start, yeah, being way more internationalist, I think.
Yeah, just to build on what Simone and Aviah said, I think that coming back to like, why did Northern Europe, like what happened in colonization and like what's the motivation? Because it was about the extraction of resources to create wealth and control globally, which then led to a need to morally justify what they were doing because it was so fucking horrendous. That created categorizations of people to control for the purpose of more generation of wealth. And so like the word that I think is really important here, which links climate justice and abolition and shows that they're the same struggle, and then also then connects us to why, as Aviah, you're saying, like our struggles internationally around this are connected, is extraction. It was all about extraction from both the planet for raw materials, in the pursuit of industrial capitalism, and the hoarding of wealth and resource, and people being extracted from within that. And so these things are like completely bound up together because in the colonizer's eyes, really grotesquely and crassly, both of those things, people and planet, were just resources for the production of wealth. And so then you get the categorization of people into fit and unfit, or into in a racialized scale of like superior and inferior, human and inhuman, and that's still both the social legacy of that, the political legacy of that, and the like ecological legacy of that still exist in the capitalist system that we have. What shifted is that the site of power in the global economy is no longer industry, it's information. And so I think like part of the challenge at the moment on all fronts is fighting the power and having an anti-capitalist analysis in our understanding of imperialism and colonization that also understands that the global north doesn't really care about industrial capitalism anymore. And so like that's really hard to like work with and I think keep up with. But I think there's also a thing here that links like abolition, like the abolition practice and climate justice practice at the moment, which is past, present and future. Like there's the need to deal with the past, which some of the movement deals with around things like reparations, both in abolition and climate justice. There's a piece of the present, which is that we have to be actively in solidarity and doing things like the Stanton 15 action and working with prisoners and working in housing and mental health institutions, etc. And then in climate justice, like challenging sites of climate injustice and companies here and now. But you also have to have a future vision. So like, we're working towards transformative futures, whether that's transformative justice or transformative climate futures. Like these things are all bound together in exactly the systems that created them and continue to maintain them. And so you can't fight any of them without fighting all of them, but we also all can't do all of it, which is one of the struggles. Like, how do we all do this all the time?
Yeah, thank you so much. I wanted to pick up a bit on obviously kind of you know, prisoning and policing was a UK export, but a lot of kind of abolition and kind of like movements and language does it like it seems to get talked a lot about in the US context, and so I wondered kind of what is similar to like how we kind of fight it, like to what's happening in the US at the moment, or and how is it different in a UK context. So yeah, how do we differentiate the fight?
I can like have a start on that, if that's all right. I think that what we've seen over the last 10 to 20 years in the UK, maybe 30, is this kind of like Americanization of our prison system in a way that we didn't have before. It's kind of like hyper capital, hyper privatized. You're like the really, really like explicit, and what Nim was talking about, you know, like readjusting the way that we extract resources from people by kind of labeling them as bad and then creating that as like a money-making machine. You know, that's very much kind of had fuel poured on it over the last 20 years with creeping privatization across our society. And so I think that that's kind of made, it's in a lot of ways, it's sort of made a lot of the Americanized sort of conversations around abolition actually more relevant to a British context. But the difficulty is that our systems are very different. You know, like the idea that a singular city in the UK could defund the police, we don't have the political apparatus to do that. We don't have the kind of local power to be able to. I mean, you know, look at the very, very limited power that Sadiq Khan, for example, has over the Metropolitan Police. You know, like all he could do when stuff was going on in Clapham. I mean, I don't particularly rate Sadiq Khan at all as a politician, but like, you know, even he was like, you know, that maybe lads, you shouldn't have gone and beaten up a load of mourning women and trampled over the flowers, and that's all that he could do. That's the limit of his power. And I think that provides a difficulty in the way that we can fight it here. I mean, I think it's as Aviah was saying, it's incredibly important to be internationalist in this, but as people based in the UK, you know, where we can be most effective in actually kind of like creating material changes is here. And we have this very specific set of circumstances in that we kind of have to move the dial for the government. You know, we don't really have these local levels, and these like kind of almost experiments isn't the right word, but these abilities to be able to sort of like shape policy on a local level that can then influence people and bring people around to an abolitionist idea, and you know what it looks like when you don't have police, what it looks like when you do fund those youth services, when you do fund community outreach, when you do like pour opportunities and funding into communities that have been historically denigrated and left behind. We don't really have that. So I think that's something that we kind of need to get our heads around. And I'm sure I have the answers. I'm sure that other panelists probably do, because they are more learned than me, and I would like to hear from them.
Yeah, I'd like to come in on that a little bit, because like I've kind of complicated my understanding of like prisons and private prisons recently with like the work of Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, who perhaps like has a little bit of beef, not actual beef, intellectual beef with Angela Davis around understanding like what is the motive of like prison expansion, like what is going on there, and like what is the, so like obviously some, you know, we've heard like quite a lot about like private prisons are a thing, profit-making prisons, and like this kind of big profit motive to get people working. And yeah, Ruth Wilson Gilmore kind of has a slightly like slanted perspective on that, where she's like, yeah, that is definitely going on, but she kind of positions it as it's not just about that, it's also about the fact that industry has left the United States and much of Western Europe, deliberately taken to the global south, and has left like whole swathes of populations without work, unemployed, and also withdrawn all of the resources that they may have needed to survive on, you know, so housing, benefits, education, all of those things under neoliberalism. Not as if it wasn't enough to lose your like job, you've also had all of those things that you would have needed to survive day to day stripped. And so you've got millions and millions and millions of people who are just neglected. And, you know, her position is like, well, yeah, they can make profit out of managing these populations, but fundamentally they just want to manage them, and they want to ensure that there is this kind of, you know, well-managed, well-controlled reserve army that can be thrown away, disposed of easily, or work as and when you need. And the same is true of the migrant population. Come and work, and we'll throw you away when we don't need you anymore. We'll deport you when we don't need you anymore. But come and work for a pittance, for below minimum wage, in absolutely horrific conditions, you know, sharing beds with, with night shift people, like other workers. But then when we don't need you anymore, we'll detain you and deport you. So, like, I guess, like, understanding, you know, there's parts of that are profit making. Those prisons, those detention centers are profit making, but it's also a little bit deeper than that in terms of like what is going on in the material conditions of what is going on with prisons, detention, and all of that is even bigger than just even those profit making companies like G4S and Serco. It's, you know, this almost ideological religious commitment to like racial capitalism, and that largely racialized people will be disposable and will be pulled into work and thrown away when they're not needed anymore, has been, you know, the commitment to that as like, you know, over the last sort of 30 years, I think is an important part of that kind of to understand. Yeah,
I just add as well to the excellent things that you both just said, that I think that there's a really substantial material difference in US movements today and British, like UK-wide movements today. And I think that we could do a whole nother conversation about why that is. I think there's lots of different factors, like just the sheer size of populations, the success of Thatcher versus Reaganism, having a social welfare state versus not having one. Like, I think there's a whole bunch of combinations of factors that contribute to that. But it means that, in my experience, working in movement spaces here and working with US and Canadian comrades, but particularly US comrades, like in the last couple of years, the difference in what movements are able to do quickly on the ground, agilely, people having different, like lots of different things, means that what often ends up here happening in a political moment in recent years is that when things kick off there, because there's not much, because the movements here have been so kneecapped, there's a lot of energy and inspiration that's taken from the success and mobilization of things happening in the US. And I don't think that's bad. And I think sometimes because we need to be smarter than that, we get frustrated and we're like, this is so bad. It's not bad to be inspired. We shouldn't only be inspired by the US. There's a danger in that. And the problem to me, I think, is that in movements, there's often two different types of demands going on. There's symbolic demands, which are the ones that galvanize, which mobilize, which inspire. And then there's instrumental demands, which are the ones that actually are, this is the change we need to make. And I think what happens in this context where we don't have thriving movements, but we take lots of inspiration from the US, is that which demands are symbolic and which instrumental get really confused. And so I think, to me, one of the biggest issues that we have at the moment in the UK is how do we take the enthusiasm and the inspiration that happens, whether we like it or not, at US demands, and make them legible here by critically engaging with them. And so, like, in trans organizing, an example is that one of the biggest issues that I think we have in trans abolitionist organizing here is that there's lots of these symbolic sound bites that come from the US about trans women of color in prison, which actually don't match on to where we are in the prison system here. So if you look at the official stats, I can't remember the exact number, but I think there's about 7 trans women of color in prison in the UK. And so, like, these kind of like grandiose demands that inspire people and garner solidarity, actually we need to be critical about, because is the question that actually we need to take a few steps back and question, is it that there are lots of trans women of color not being recorded as trans women of color and underrepresented in the stats, and what's going on there, and is that where we need to focus our attention right now? Or is violence manifesting differently here? Is it manifesting more in housing crises or in gendered violence? And so how do we then orient the symbolic demands to the actual instrumental demands of what we're working towards here? And I think it's that mechanism of pivoting between those things that we could be focusing a bit more on sometimes in the inspiration from the US. But I think there's a lot of critical thought there as well, because, you know, the abolitionist resistance has just been deeper and wider for a lot longer. And like, it's like, that's cool. Ruthie Wilson Gilmore is great. I love reading Ruthie, and, you know, like, I think we just have to be more critical in how we apply it.
Thank you so much, everyone, for that. I wanted to turn to, so there is a writer and teacher who is based in the US called Joseph Capehart. They wrote a piece for us, and I'm going to directly quote because it's brilliant. Abolition exposes and challenges us beyond our reliance on systems of punishment to solve our problems, raise our children, and build our communities. And so, yeah, I'd like to kind of talk about like systems of punishment and how we change this. I am also really interested in the idea of kind of like, I don't know, abolition for like in a school setting, which if anyone has any points on, I'd love to hear them. But yeah, so how do current systems of punishment sort of like uphold like the prison industrial complex, and how do we change this?
Oh, I can jump in here for a little bit. I think like where, like speaking on education spaces, like it starts so young. Like I can speak about universities, which I can speak to, but it also starts from like the age of like 5-4 from nursery, and like where education spaces are meant to be like spaces for like deeper and critical thought and like learning and enjoyable and collaborative. They actually are spaces where students don't see themselves reflected in the national curriculum, nor is the history or present of Britain's empire and colonialism and exploitation like reflected in what we are taught and learned. And like classrooms have become sort of spaces for like surveillance and punishment, where in place care and understanding should be at the forefront. And like we're seeing young students, particularly like Black, Brown and Muslim students, like surveilled under like the Prevent Duty, which is a state surveillance program, and forced to undergo sort of de-radicalization in quotation marks classes. And like where prevent has been proven to be like a redundant tactic in like combating any form of extremism. And it also defines like extremism under like a white supremacist logic, which only serves to like punish marginalized people more. And like looking at the far white right, this allows like for things like the National Front or like EDL to like manifest, because they're not actually seen as radical, rather they reflect like our white supremacist state and society, particularly here in the UK, but across the globe. And like, I think additionally to like touch on the school to prison pipeline, like where children or young people as young as 4 are like put into isolation, or they're excluded, or they're expelled, or they're moved to like secure schools or like centers. And like an example is like NEX Exclusions is an abolitionist group that work very heavily on this, and they're brilliant. And it's like there's no inquisition into like what's going on in that young person's life, like such as maybe not having adequate support for like a disability, or dealing with trauma, or like a home circumstance, or being hungry, or being tired, or overwhelmed, for example, overworked and overwhelmed. And like there's so much to explore. This kind of reflects a wider society of like why the school to prison pipeline and just like prison industrial complex in general is such a crux for society and like inequality, is that it rather than like exploring what is going on in a young person's life or what's going on in society, they would rather imply carceral measures, because these schools not only become comparative to prisons in how they operate and how they look like, because some of them are built by like the security companies that build private prisons, but also they kind of leave little room for young people to be reintegrated back into society. Like quite often these young people stay out of like mainstream schools for their whole life, and often aren't supported in going back into the world. And like the use of like punitive measures, both in schools and in prisons and in our like general society through like punitive measures and like surveillance measures, means that like it again, like it puts the crux on the individual and the individual circumstances, rather than a massive state failure to meet people's basic needs. And then like it also kind of expanding onto universities, it also means that like we can see how universities play a massive role in the process of gentrification as well, and like taking away homes and land from like working class people of color communities and areas, and like essentially replacing a population with people for capital and profit, or for profit. And like we've seen those patterns before, like in colonialism, many lands were stolen and dispossessed, many communities were killed and dispossessed in order for, you know, profit and extraction to happen. So again, we're seeing how like these models of like extraction for profit, as well as like the disposability of certain kinds of people, has consistently reformed over time from slavery until now.
Did anyone else want to come in on that? I know, Simone, you made some absolutely excellent points, but just before I move on, does anyone else want to come in on that point?
I could just add that I think coming back to that framework I mentioned before of like past, present, and future, like looking at the past of education, as Simone just so eloquently said, there's a question about like who is entitled to education and what for. And so I think like one of the things recently that has been in the press is the discovery of 215 bodies of children at a residential school, or in a grave at a residential school in Canada from colonial settlers running the school projects there, and the Catholic Church. And I think like to understand education and the evolution of it and what purpose it serves in society, you also then have to go back and look at like why was it established and why is it set up, and that brings you to the present and things like the SEND model, special educational needs, and the fact that most people who end up in SEND classes are like, I'm really bad at remembering them. I don't have a brain for like, I don't have one of those brains that remembers stats on the spot, so I'm sorry about that, but like I think it's like twice as likely or more than twice as likely to end up in prison than anybody else. And so like the SEND model doesn't often support people, whether it's through disability access, as Simone said, or because of racialized behaviors, etc., that end up in SEND classes, that don't often then support schooling, not because they weren't great people trying to do their best, teachers in the everyday trying to do their absolute best in that model, but because the model isn't designed for that purpose. The model is designed to try and fit children through a cookie cutter to become good laborers for the workforce and learn a lot of specific behaviors. And so I think the thing that I really liked, the next line I really liked of Joseph, of that quote that you pulled out from Joseph from the article that they wrote, which was, it is incapable of providing, so he's talking about justice and the punitive model of justice. It is incapable of providing easy answers to issues of harm because it is that desire for ease that the criminal punishment system takes advantage of. And I think that we often have this idea that justice is done quickly because that's set up from both the education system into the workplace. You do something bad and you receive a quick punishment, and that's justice. Justice is rarely, in my experience, ever done quickly. And I think it's also in activist communities where we often fall down in trying to do alternative justice models, which is that we still try to make them happen very quickly. And like I said at the beginning, like my work is often like in educational spaces with with activists and campaigners. And like, I'm really interested in the practice of how you do justice in the everyday in an educational setting that is really different. And it can be really difficult because people expect you to deal with something that they feel harmed by in a moment. And when you're not willing to do that, people feel unsupported. And so like, I think one of the things in Joseph's piece, which I really appreciated, was this talking of like trying to do these new modes of justice has to be in the everyday and in the small and in the big, because we kind of have to be creating models all the time, because we can't just impose one new model on. That's not what abolitionists are trying to do. We're not trying to just remove prisons. We're trying to like really reorient our worlds away from harm creation to care. And that takes practice, it takes consent, it takes work, and there is no one size fits all solution. So I think like that's true in the educational space and in the other spaces that Joseph pointed to as well, from like raising children to how we interact with our neighbors. And the thing is, we actually do those things all the time, which is a thing that I often find really funny about, how it's like, we've never done it, we don't know. And it's like, we often in close relationships practice different models of justice because we don't just want to harm somebody that we care about. So like, whether it's with our neighbors when they're annoying us or other people, like family members or friends or whatever, like we're practicing different models of justice all the time. And I think that that's really important, so that we're bringing in a new world now and not only focusing on breaking down the one that we've got, because if you do too much of that without thinking about what comes next, then you don't control what comes next. And history tells us that is a very scary place to be.
Definitely, yeah, thank you so much for that. I thought we are kind of running out of time, but I did want to kind of look to slightly more positives, and all of the panelists here are part of excellent organising groups which do brilliant work, and I wanted to ask if kind of anyone could point to anything that might have happened in the last couple of years, the last few years, which might make abolition as kind of such a multifaceted like framework, but might make it, for those who don't necessarily believe it, is something that is more feasible. So where have we seen kind of like abolitionist frameworks working? I guess could we talk a bit about like the Stanford 15 result in January, if that's
oh yeah yeah, we can. I was there like desperately thinking, I was like, oh yeah, duh. So I mean, I think one thing, like I'll kind of come to the Stanford 15, but I think one thing that's like been incredibly inspiring and has been the kind of like the huge explosion of BLM over the last year. And obviously BLM has been around like in its current kind of format since like 2014, 2015. But this kind of the reaction across the globe and the conversations that started from that. And there's been a lot of bad and a lot of weaponization of those conversations around defunding the police and things like that, but also just putting that on the map and putting that question and people talking about it has been incredible and actually really, really inspiring. And there have been so many more conversations about what that looks like, what justice looks like. And Joseph's piece was really, really interesting because it was talking about Derek Chauvin and this idea, as Nim was kind of just touching on now, like this idea of justice and this like vindictive, reinforcing of the prison industrial complex, reinforcing of this like punitive justice. It's thrown up all of these questions. So for me, actually, that although it hasn't necessarily sort of like materially brought anything yet, it's provided this huge open space for us to have a lot of these conversations, which I think is incredibly important. I think that we need to start kind of understanding stuff that Simone was saying in terms of education. I think it's so incredibly important, and the way that our education system is set up is, as Nim was saying, kind of to force people through these cookie cutters. But I think we also need to look at it within like a recent context, of cuts and austerity and of like the gutting of our various different welfare systems and the very limited opportunities that people had, but much smaller now. And so we've seen like a huge jump. I think it went from like 25% of like juveniles who were in prison were from Black and minority ethnic groups in 2006, and it jumped up to 41% in 2016. And that's obviously, there are lots of reasons for that, but one thing that you can look at is that we know that austerity has affected different groups that are already denigrated much worse. So we kind of need to be when we're having these big conversations about defunding the police, which have been sparked by these incredibly inspiring movements, we can start to lace in some of the other stuff. And when Nim was saying earlier, we need to sort of come at all of these problems at once. And this is kind of the way to do it, isn't it? It's to sort of like, when we're having this one conversation, we can then bring in the impact of austerity. And as Simone really eloquently did earlier, we can bring in the way that climate justice is kind of like playing out within this framework. It wasn't really a particularly great answer, I don't think, but like, yeah, basically I'm very inspired by lots of things that are happening.
Yeah, I was gonna like kind of touch on that. Obviously, Black Lives Matter is like go-to in terms of abolitionist movements that are kind of movements that make you feel like you can taste abolition, and like you can taste like something's coming or something's in the air. And yeah, like, I mean, you know, Ben, in one of your earlier answers, like mentioned the events around Clapham Common recently and what that like kind of emerged out of that with the Kill the Bill movement. And what I think is really interesting about that is like how quickly people's like understanding and conceptions around policing can shift. Within hours, you know, the terrain of the conversation had really shifted based on like violence against women, which is usually the go-to thing to give the police and prisons more power. That's usually the go-to thing, is like, yeah, we need to deal with domestic and sexual violence. Think of the poor women. We need more police. We need longer prison sentences. And there's usually an argument that, you know, a lot of people, you know, find actually harder to refute when it comes to abolitionist conversations. And the events surrounding the murder of Sarah Everard and then the police response to the vigil held in her name, you know, and the police brutality that everyone saw and witnessed kind of really shifted the conversation in a way, and very quickly, in a way that was quite interesting to me, because people who ordinarily I think would have much more liberal and reformist understandings around these ideas suddenly were like much more open to the idea that perhaps policing is not going to be the place where we protect women from domestic and sexual violence, and that actually the police are the perpetrators. And like a lot of people who, you know, a few months ago, I don't think would have really felt that, you know, were really starting to grasp that and open their mind to that idea. But yeah, and I think like what that's then given, you know, given way to since the events around Clapham is the Kill the Bill movement, which is, you know, as I was saying, is a broad-based movement based on solidarity. And because it hits so many different communities, it creates like ready-made solidarity. You know, it's interesting. You'd think like they would learn, don't hit us all at once, because then we all just get together and then like create solidarity. But cool. All right, we are where we are. Very happy to be in a movement based on solidarity with Gypsy Roma travelers, with Black and brown community, with migrants, you know, people fighting against school exclusion, secure schools, sex workers, people in the protest movement. Like it's just like, it's an amazing thing to be able to respond to that with genuine and proactive solidarity. And I think that the analysis is starting to sharpen. The next stage is like the organizing has to sharpen, right? So like we've seen the big mobilizations, we've got the analysis to hand, and now it's like, okay, so how are we actually going to organize in an abolitionist kind of framing? And yeah, one thing that I do take a lot of inspiration from is, you know, looking at the events that happened a few weeks ago in Glasgow, amazing anti-raids resistance, spontaneous, partly organized. And I think that we are going to have to get a little bit braver and a little bit organized and a little bit more, more skills to see more of that kind of resistance to this bill, but in policing, policing in general.
Absolutely. I've got a question from the audience. Our shadow audience is often like very engaged with climate justice, and I think it's a really interesting question. Someone has asked, does anyone have any thoughts on using like the current justice system as part of climate action? So obviously we've talked about how climate justice and abolition is intrinsically linked, but what about, like, for example, taking fossil fuel companies to court? It's a big question. Does anyone kind of have anything to say on that?
I mean, I do, but also other people haven't spoken for a while, so I'll like bow to them if they want to.
I was just going to say something, which is that actually this builds on from the thinking I had on the last question anyway, which was that I think part of the problem when you ask question, like I think that we were all silent when you first asked the question, is there an example of abolition happening? And like the worry that I get into with that is that people think that therefore it's not possible because it's hard to pinpoint examples. But the reason it's hard to pinpoint examples is that we live in these systems. And so what we're trying to do is abolish the systems. And we haven't abolished the systems. And so abolition looks like day-to-day practices or abolitionist reform of the current systems, which often then gets co-opted and reverted. So I just want to say that because I think partly it's an important part of understanding abolition, and that it's not that it inherently fails or can't win. We do abolition, like I said before, every day together. We just don't necessarily realize it's that. And I think then that builds on this question, which is like a comparative thing here might be things like gender-based violence. And like we understand that the police are the perpetrators of a significant amount of gender-based violence. I would support a friend in any choice they made in pursuing justice on their terms, no matter what, for them, for their own empowerment. It doesn't mean that like I think they're a bad person because the system is fucked and it's the only option that they feel they have available. And I think there's a difference between using the laws and in the way I understood it from the question and colluding with punitive justice. I do think sometimes people reach far too quickly as punitive justice for the answer. Like some of the responses to the Sarah Everard vigil were we should lock all of these cops up, or we should like sack them, like these individuals should be sacked from their jobs. And like the default frame that people use to know how to respond to these moments is punitive again. I think that's a different thing than, for example, taking companies to court, which I think can be a useful short-term. Again, I come back to the model. I always come back to this model of past, present, and future. You have to deal with all three. So like, I think that sometimes in the present, you have to utilize the tools that are available, like using laws to stop people doing things because it's what's available. But you also have to understand that the law is not justice. And like, I think that there's just a tension in that sometimes, and a kind of self-awareness and criticalness and a movement accountability of us saying to each other, like, or asking each other, do you think this colludes too much with the system? And I think sometimes we're not in relationship with each other enough to have those conversations, and so they just end up as Twitter spats talking shit at each other. But like, yeah, it's not easy, but like there's a balancing of using the tools and not using the tools.
Yeah, like just to very quickly add on to that as well. Like I think it's difficult, right? Like definitely bouncing off what Nim said, I think like it like using punitive measures or like, yeah, the legal justice system, it often like takes too long, and like quite often the result isn't necessarily the justice that we want to see, and quite often the damage is done and very irreversibly done as well. And like speaking in like a climate justice or climate context, like there like the money that is kind of used for this legal the legal process, which does take long and requires lawyers and requires all sorts, there's space for that money, I think, especially to be supporting movements on the ground and putting that into organizing, training, and mobilizing people, climate groups, and like groups of other sort of social and environmental justice issues to come together to like mobilize and like hold our institutions and private companies to account. I think like an example to relate that to is like the Ogoni Nine, and like in Nigeria, the movement for Ogoni people mobilized around 300,000 people against Shell in the 1980s. And they did that through like the women of the group educated other women on like what the issues were. They also looked after children at that time. They made sure that women had a skill or a trade, and like also were like safety sort of almost like safety observers at the protest. So you can see how like that kind of organizing and bringing people on meant that they were able to sort of challenge Shell in such a big way that in fact like they kind of disappeared the organizers because it was so much of a threat. And I think that we can create those things. And like to add on to that as well, like it's 25 years later, 25 to 30 years later that Shell has finally you know, like they've lost that case and they have to pay like some funding, some money to the Nigerian government for what they did 30 years ago. And quite frankly, that is in fact like too long. And it's like, imagine if they had waited all of that 30 years to finally take them to court rather than mobilizing on their own terms. And I think the important thing about like focusing on like mobilizing together and like mass movements is that that is where like the change comes, and that's where the pressure comes from. So it's like we shouldn't, again, as Nim said, like sort of, and what everyone else has been saying, relying on all of these legal and punitive measures, because like when we come together, like we have the resources and education and skills among us to take these systems down.
Yeah, thank you so much. We've already gone a tiny bit over, but if people could indulge me for one more question, which is also a big one, and I think there could be a whole panel on it, and there should be, but could I kind of hear from our panelists about like how do we practice collective care, which is something which is crucial to the abolitionist movement? Does anyone want to come in?
I can come in very quickly. I think again, to me, this comes back to the day-to-day and solidarity and being in relationship with people. And I think that like collective care, when I've experienced collective care in my life, it's because I'm part of a community of people who are in community because of shared interest, whether that's physical interest where I grew up on the street that I like the area that I grew up when everyone like we were like when you're poor and like you literally share the resources of the street with each other, or whether that's as like a trans organizer sharing access to community knowledge around healthcare because we are gatekept from healthcare. But I also think it's like it's the practice of just talking to your neighbors. Like I think sometimes it's community care, like, and building relationship and then showing up for each other in that relationship. And I think sometimes we try to politicize it too much so that we stop seeing each other as humans in relationship and connection to each other, but as political actors that we're trying to get to do things or because for the greater good, or like sometimes I think in movements we end up there's this question of like where's your home and where's your political home, because I think sometimes one of the things that breaks down activist groups very quickly is when people have started to create their home in the activist group and people aren't getting any resource of care from anywhere else. Sorry, I'm going off on a bit of a tangent here, but one of the like I don't really have ground rules in spaces, in training spaces, or when I work with groups, but one of the few that I have is take care of yourself so that you can show up for the group. And I think the message that we get from society is take care of yourself. No one's got your back but you, so buy your own bubble bath. But like, I think the second part of that sentence, which I think it comes from a collective in the US called Training for Change, is so you can show up for the group. And that but necessitates like also taking care of other people, like and being able to depend on them to take care of yourself. And I know that one of the things that I've had to do for myself over the years is like work on my own sense of fear of other people, like particularly being like whether it's trans or racialized or whatever, that I got to a point in my life where I became very insular in my community because I was like, oh, I don't want to have to deal with transphobia today, and like actually there was no space for anybody else in that. And so I've had to like, while that comes from a real place that's legitimate, like doing the work with myself of like, why am I convinced? Like how have I like, what's the word? Internalized that idea of other people so much that actually I'm not in relationship with people. I'm not building relationship with people anymore. And yeah, doing that in the day-to-day. Sorry, I really waffled there.
I would kind of like add and build on that. Oh, where are you going to come in?
You go.
Yeah, all right. I'll be really quick. I was going to kind of like add and build on that. I think that it's really important that we have a relationship with people, and I think it's really important the context and where those relationships take place. I think that there's a lot, particularly over the Planning D, like the fact that we've all been very separate, the fact that everything has had to take place like over the internet, like fundamentally Twitter is not a great place to be having those relationships and to be having those conversations. Like, it's a great place to disseminate information. It's a great place to kind of have some conversations, but like coming together as groups of people in ways that we can, in different ways and in good faith. And I think there's a lot of that lacks in a lot of the movement, and a lot of distrust. And I think that, like, you know, that's only kind of solved by people putting themselves out there and being a bit more kind of understanding, and, you know, like, not bending on your political principles, and, you know, not taking shit, but also sort of trying to meet people where they are, and understanding that the majority of people want a good life. The majority of people want a nice life for the people around them. You know, like, that's a feeling that you can grow and grow and grow, and, you know, move it from just them and the people around them to more and more and more. And I think that only comes by, yeah, I kind of coming at those conversations and relationships in the best of faiths.
Yeah, I think I was just going to say, like, I think we really need to spend some time investing in our kind of community and like movement infrastructure. I think it's been decimated over the last 30-40 years, and like a lot of the problems that we've been talking about in terms of that we're facing around this introspective and, you know, feeling just not very strong individually, but also in terms of our connection to one another, comes down to the fact that we don't have the infrastructure to back us up, to make us feel powerful, to make us feel strong, to make us feel like, you know, brave. Do you know what I mean? So that's when we kind of like want to go back into our like homes and do that introspective stuff. Yeah, we need to rebuild that urgently, and we need to rebuild it in a way that reflects the kind of situation that we're facing in the 21st century. You know, we've had big trade union movements and like all of those things, and now it's probably going to be part of that, but it's also going to be thinking about what we need and what our communities need. And I think Sivanand calls it communities of resistance. You know, the social centers, the political education, the support networks, the mutual aid. Like, we need to invest in these things in order to create systems of collective care that aren't just, you know, that aren't disposable, and that actually make us feel brave and strong. And like the kind of comments that people have made around, like, yeah, it's difficult when you're confronting issues around people's like racism and transphobia, and that you know, that we've all had moments where we've had to just take a step back and it's just too much. But at the same token, like, some of us need to be in that fight, and some of us need to be maintaining those connections with people, because fundamentally our struggles are bound up with each other's, and it's not really going to work long term if we keep backing away from each other and we don't have that infrastructure to make us feel like, okay, we can lean into that with a little bit more strength and a little bit more understanding, and with accountability as well. And I think, you know, I take a lot of like inspiration from the stuff that's going on like Rojava. You know, they're really serious about accountability, daily accountability, not waiting until things get messy and it gets like, you know, actually we're so passive aggressive in this country. No one ever tells each other they're pissed off at each other. It's like, we need to actually just get more used to that. Do you know what I mean? And like, yeah, the way in which they approach that in Rojava, in terms of that, like, grounding that in the movement, you know, these seem like weird little interpersonal things, but it's like, nah, this is the stuff that actually breaks us if we don't deal with it. So yeah, the infrastructure and changing the whole culture of how we communicate with each other, I think, is fundamental to collective care.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I will wrap us up there because we're already over time, but thank you so much to this brilliant panel of speakers, and to the audience as well. Thank you so much for joining us. Please do keep up to date with everything that Shado is doing. We've got our latest print issue, which is still on sale, and you can get it via our shop to read some more brilliant articles. I've already plugged a couple in this event, but yeah, basically a huge thank you to everyone for showing up today, and I really loved this chat, and I hope you did too.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having us. Take care, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.